Thanks for coming. My presentation is going to be focused on privacy by design. To kind of get us started, first go through the agenda really quickly. First, introduction to myself, just who I am. You may have seen my face. I've not had a chance to say hello to everybody, so a little bit of who I am, what I do here at Crownpeak. What the background of privacy by design. You may have heard that phrase before. In fact, we've mentioned it a few times in today's presentations. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. 7 steps of that framework. Data protection impact assessments, which are outlined or kind of a necessity for privacy by design. And then privacy by design using Crownpeak, the products that we offer, particularly since our Evidon acquisition. So by way of introduction, my name is Gabe Morazan. I'm Senior Product Manager here for Digital Governance Team. Actually joined Evidon in 2016, back when we were Ghostery. As you all may have heard or may not have known, Crownpeak acquired Evidon, which is why we're talking about Evidon now. So now we are part of the Crownpeak family. My background is information systems. I'm actually currently studying for the Certified Internet Privacy Technician, CIPT. So privacy generally is one of the areas that I'm passionate about. It's part of the reason why I came here and started working here. And then just kind of some fun facts about me. Love football. Actually a big Spurs fan, even though I'm in the States. Love historical fiction, and I'm a huge craft beer fan. So just a little bit about me. But what is privacy by design? So for a lot of you, it may be the first time that you've heard of the term privacy by design, but the truth is that it's actually been around for a while. And the reason we're even talking about it is because it's part of GDPR now, right? Where previously privacy by design was a framework, it established best practices. Now within Article 25 of GDPR, it actually lists out as the title, data protection by design and by default. And the idea of the framework, which we'll walk into a little bit more, is really just the concept that data protection should be the default experience. It should be the proactive approach. You shouldn't wait until you've got a company like Cambridge Analytica sharing third-party information about your customers before you take data protection seriously. That's really kind of the high-level concept, but what used to be best practices, what used to be recommended by privacy officials now has been codified into law itself. So it's now more or less, it is a GDPR requirement. So a little bit of background on what privacy by design is. It's a framework. It's established in '95 by the Information Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. And again, there was really 7 foundational steps to privacy by design. We'll walk through each one of those steps individually here in a second. But the most important thing to recognize is that the purpose of the framework is to get companies to take data protection seriously, right? Again, you shouldn't wait for data breaches. You shouldn't wait for third-party data leaks to start taking security and data protection seriously. And so this is really what this means. It's about setting up proactive procedural steps in your company to make sure that you're able to avoid those kind of breaches that are happening now and you're hearing from companies like Equifax and Facebook. So let's start with the first step. Number 1, being proactive and not reactive. It's taking preemptive steps to ensure that data protection is consistent across the board. It's number 1 for a reason, and it's because this is largely an organizational culture. It's a mindset, right? As a company, at a high level, at your leadership level, do you talk about data protection? Do you talk about customers' privacy and right? If you don't, that's something that you'll want to start looking at, right? Not just because GDPR, but for the reasons that we've outlined in some of the other presentations around it's important for your customers, particularly now as they're being more sensitive to the data that's being collected on them. And so in a lot of ways, setting up this proactive, not reactive, it's a cultural mindset. It's ensuring that the values of the company align with this idea of people's personal rights, right? Fundamental human right, as it's been listed out in GDPR. But you can also take steps to monitor the type of technologies you're using on the site to ensure that you're staying on top of it and you're actually taking proactive steps as opposed to, again, reacting to data breaches and leaks. So one of the examples of this is Apple's commitment to privacy. Now, Apple obviously can do a little bit more, right? They aren't perfect. But since the beginning, since Steve Jobs has been talking about data protection and privacy, well before Facebook was getting hit where they are with Cambridge Analytica, he talked about the need of being transparent, about being forward, telling people what you're planning to use their information for. And so some of you that may have an iOS device may have noticed that in the last few weeks, one of their iOS updates actually included this new data privacy screen that's over here on the left-hand side. The focus of this is Apple is trying to ensure to their customers that they take data protection seriously, right? Again, first step is proactive, not reactive. It's a mindset, it's a cultural thing. From Steve Jobs down to Tim Cook, who is the CEO now, they consistently talk about privacy being important to them as an organization. On top of this, it's the ability to stay on top of the marketing technologies and third-party vendors that you're working with. Who do you currently have on your site that may be capturing and collecting data for the purposes of advertising, retargeted, interest-based advertising, those type of things? With Crownpeak's technologies, which we'll talk a little about in a minute, you have the ability to stay on top of it, scan your website, and identify some of these third-party vendors who you may not have a direct relationship with, but nonetheless, they're actually collecting some of your customer data. So be alerted to unknown technologies that appear on the site. Step 2 of the framework is the idea of privacy by default. It's really just this idea that if a user doesn't take any steps, so they log into your site or your app for the first time, their privacy should be protected and respected. There's a few ways that you can start to do this. Number one, it's being very specific on the information that you're collecting and the use of it. If I capture your email address, this is what it's going to be used for. If I capture your phone number, your address, this is what it's going to be used for. It's very specific and it's not going to be used for any other means. As you start thinking about disclosure with GDPR, you start thinking about ways that you are capturing and generating that data, so lead gen forms, email marketing campaigns, it's ensuring that the purpose that you list out for use of it is the only specific purpose that you're using it for. So for example, by signing up to our newsletter, you expect to receive a newsletter every month. That doesn't mean that you should also use this for solicitation of another event, unless you have actually specified, hey, we'll also click here if you approve of this particular use. Limiting the amount of information you collect only for what's necessary, minimizing personal data as much as possible, which we'll talk about in just a second. But it's really all of these concepts that as you capture, store, and keep data of your customers, you're limiting it to very specific uses, all of which has been actually outlined in your privacy policy and your cookie consent or any of your forms that would disclose this. And then in terms of retention, you're also only storing it for as long as necessary, right? Gone are the days that you can sit on personal data for years until you make sense of it or have some advantage or can put it to use. You want to make sure that you're limiting your exposure, particularly as GDPR is coming into full force. So one of the examples here is user IDs, right? How do I track a user who might be visiting my site? Generally, historically, you may have used things like IP address, a user agent, the device that they're coming in. All of that now can consistently be tracked back to a certain individual. So it's personal data, right? So if we look at minimization, how can we capture this and still create some kind of a way to see how long a user has spent on our site, for instance? It is taking some of that personal information, using cryptography to hash it, storing all of that personal information separately. So now you've got a unique user ID that not only would be incredibly difficult to hack, but would require some other data to ultimately trace it back to a natural person, right? It's taking those additional steps to ensure that if, on the unlikely chance, your data is actually getting hacked, this is what someone's going to get. There's not really a natural person that you can collect from that. You need some other information in another database, and you can see we even went one step further by actually partially collecting IP address instead of all of it. Right? So those are examples of as you start to create campaigns and as you start to manage things, track on your site, how you can still collect this, of course, assuming that you've disclosed and that the user has given consent for this type of collection, but that you can store it in such a way that you're reducing the risk and you're implementing privacy by default. Embed privacy into design. One of the things I want to focus and emphasize here is when I say design, it's not just the UI, it's not just the look and feel, right? When we talk about designs, we're talking about system design as well. And that includes things like, where is this data going to be stored? What are you going to use this data for? This is where things like the data protection impact assessments are particularly useful because you can start to determine if we embark on a campaign that's going to rely and utilize personal data, what risks do we as a company have in actually collecting this information, utilizing this information, and what are the steps that we've taken to minimize that risk, which we'll go through a DPIA here in just a minute. Then as far as third-party partners that you're working with, you may work with Facebook, you may work with AppNexus, you may work with OpenX, MediaMath, all of these organizations that serve purposes, ensuring that you have proper protection agreements in place with those, particularly what are called DPAs or data protection agreements. It is ensuring that the third-party vendors are taking your customers' data just as seriously as you are, right? That's one of the items that's not only legally required, but it's also helpful in thinking, again, through your system design, how are we protecting our users' information from when it's first hitting our site all the way to any partners that may be utilizing it. Entailing full functionality. This is one of the key elements that's coming out of GDPR. Gone are the days where a user can say, you know, to visit our site, you've got to give us permission to drop cookies, or you've got to give us permission, right? Because part of GDPR is that it's got to be freely given. And so this is one of the areas where you can start to look at saying, how can we capture information and make it a win-win scenario for our organization and also for the user, right? So avoid unnecessary trade-offs. An example that I give is use of this site constitute consent, or to use this site, you've got to give consent. Not only is it not compliant with the law, but it's fundamentally flawed in terms of it's creating this false dichotomy. It assumes that I have to have your personal information for you to access and use this site, which ultimately is just not really in line with kind of the overall spirit of what we're trying to accomplish with privacy by design. One of the examples that we have here, with our consent tools, you have two styles that you can actually serve up a notice on a site. One that actually allows the user to continue to navigate through the site and utilize it without actually being blocked or prevented just for the sake of consent. As you can see in the case of this example, we've got a banner up at the top. The user can still freely access the site, but what's happening in the background is we're blocking cookies from being dropped. So this way the user's information is not being collected until they've expressed and given their informed consent, but you also aren't preventing them from accessing portions of your site. It's positive sum, it's full functionality. The fifth step on this is really ensuring end-to-end security. And this is where we start to cross between privacy and security, right? Where privacy is kind of the data collection of individuals' information, and security is, of course, how you maintain that, right? How can you anonymize some of that information? How do you encrypt that data? It's ensuring that along the means, whether you're capturing an email, you're capturing a phone number, anything that can be naturally identified with a natural person, it's ensuring that that information is stored for a set period of time, and you know who has access to that on the teams, right? Who has access to our Marketo account, for instance? Who has access to the customer databases that you may be utilizing? And then, of course, how is that data being transmitted? Is it over a secure page like HTTPS or versus HTTP, right? It's starting to take security into place because, again, you're looking to protect your users' data as much as possible. The sixth and the seventh are pretty similar, and these are kind of really focused on the individual itself. The sixth step is maintaining transparency, being open and honest and clear about your use of personal data. It sounds like it's repetitious, and in part it is, right? It's really trying to emphasize this idea that you should be clear and as plain as possible when you're trying to disclose what type of information you may collect and what the use of it is. Adrian had a great example in his presentation earlier about the pizza and the soda examples, right? Is how are you using a user's individual, personal data, and what is it being used for? So one of the things that I did is there's actually if you're familiar with lorem ipsum, there is a legal ipsum that's available online that just puts together a bunch of jargon words that you can use for filler, right? And it's purposely supposed to look like some horrible terms of use because everyone's kind of become accustomed to these legal documents that are incredibly difficult to interpret. And so it's kind of the example of, you know, bad legalese that makes it very difficult for somebody to understand what you're going to use your data for. And then an example that we have in one of our notices, which is very simple, plain language that says, this is what we collect, these are the companies we work with, this is the type of information that we use, this is why we use these type of companies. And then, of course, on the last step, it's really respecting the user privacy, right? Keeping it user-centric, focusing on defaults, clear and simple disclosures, and easy-to-use settings, right? To really empower the user to maintain and take control of their personal data. One of the things that we have with our ad notice solution is you can see different levels of disclosures here that basically allow a user to understand when an ad is served by this company, this is what goes into it, these are the companies that we utilize, and provide a user the means to be able to opt out of data collection or tracking across the web. Again, respect the user's right to privacy and assume that they'll want to take control of their personal data should they be given the ability to do so. Really quickly on data protection assessments, this is particularly helpful in documenting a lot of what we talked about here, right? Part of GDPR isn't necessarily just doing the procedural, it's also requiring that you document this, store those documents in some easily accessible way should you ever be audited or should you ever have to defend the use of personal data. And so data protection impact assessment, this is actually a checklist that ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, has put together. When we send out our slides, you'll see the link that I send this out, but what it effectively does is it goes through these steps of what we've kind of talked about here, so that when you're embarking on a campaign that uses personal data, again, this could be a marketing campaign where you're using profiling to try to target a specific group or segment of individuals. You start to go through each one of these steps to identify what type of risk your organization may face and how you can minimize this, right? So some of the things that you can do, for instance, what are the severity of any risks to individual rights and interests? Have you implemented measures, identified and integrated them into project plans? Do you need to consult with ICO? Most of the time that's more for mass surveillance, but in some cases it's really just starting to include this as part of your project process. So as you embark on these campaigns, you're going through the necessary steps to ensure that users' privacy and data protection is protected. Now, lastly, I just want to talk about how Crownpeak can help you on this, right? Privacy by design using Crownpeak tools. Again, we start to look at some of the different tools that we offer. Privacy by default. Our universal consent platform allows you to block cookies when a user first visits a site and continue to block cookies and tags until the user has actually given their express consent. And as I mentioned earlier, full functionality is guaranteed because with one of our styles, it actually can just serve as a simple banner at the bottom of the page so they can continue to access and navigate the site while not actually providing consent necessarily outright. And it also maintains transparency and focus on user privacy. Again, everything that you see here is customizable, but our default text, kind of our boilerplate text that we include, is really focused on clean, plain, simple language, right? What is it that you're doing with this information? What can you as a user actually expect to receive back from our use of your personal data? As far as some of our proactive measures, Tag Auditor is a tool that we offer from Evidon by Crownpeak. It's a way to be proactive, as I mentioned earlier, scanning your websites to identify what type of vendors, third-party companies you may be working with that may be collecting personal data on your customers, right? Who are these companies? What type of data do they collect? What cookies get dropped on the site? And then ultimately, what are their privacy policy practices, right? That's the type of ways that you can ensure that you're being proactive and not reacting to some kind of company like Cambridge Analytica who may be abusing personal data, right? In terms of transparency and focus on user privacy, we also have our app notice, which allows you to disclose and allow a user to take control of their privacy preferences within a mobile app. So whether it's iOS or Android, you have the ability to disclose what type of SDKs or advertising technologies may exist, like say AdMob by Google, which generally has some interest-based advertising associated with it, and allows the user to be able to opt in and out of that particular advertising technology. Again, thinking about the user, giving them control and rights, and being absolutely clear about what this information and what these companies are doing with their personal data. And then lastly is our Ad Notice program. Ad Notice works with DAA, EDAA, the various organizations that looking to establish best practices in interest-based and online-based advertising. It's the idea that if you are using technologies for the purposes of remarketing, you're using AppNexus, MediaMath, you're using DoubleClick, for instance, it's disclosing the type of vendors that are serving up these advertisings across the web so that a user has the ability to, one, understand how this ad was served to them, and then two, opt out of that, right? Again, privacy by design. It means that you're ultimately thinking about the user, you're taking a user-centered approach, and you're giving them the necessary tools to take control of their privacy at any time. So that's all that I had for you. Any questions?